There are betrayals so spectacular I could only stand back and smile as my enemy dug his own grave. The day my cheating husband threw me out with a signed divorce petition, he thought he had stolen everything. He bragged about selling my inherited estate for $12 million, but he had no idea the deed he transferred was not a piece of luxury real estate, but a perfectly engineered death trap waiting to swallow his greed. Hello, everyone. Before today's story begins, we'd like to share a quick message. YouTube recently removed our monetization, cutting off our income. If you enjoy this story, we humbly ask for just $1 to help pay our staff so they can make a living and keep creating for you. Thank you for saving us. Now, let's begin the story. My name is Nova Dixon. I am 35 years old, a senior systems architect working for Cipher Edge Innovations. I spent my days building impenetrable security networks, predicting every possible breach, and fortifying digital walls for multinational corporations. Yet, with all my logical algorithms and predictive models, I completely missed the glaring, catastrophic vulnerability hiding in my own home. I had just returned to Charleston after a grueling, 3-week-long business trip across the country. The damp, sweet air of the South Carolina coast usually brought me immediate comfort. I was utterly exhausted from the flights, but thrumming with nervous anticipation. Tomorrow was our 8th wedding anniversary, and I had managed to finish my software project early to surprise my husband, Julian. As I steered my car down the long, sweeping cobblestone driveway toward the beautiful historic mansion my late aunt had left me, I pictured his face lighting up. I imagined a quiet, romantic evening wrapped in the familiar, gas-lit embrace of my childhood sanctuary. Instead, I pulled up to find a waking nightmare unfolding on my front porch. Julian was not alone. He was leaning against the ornate wrought iron railing, looking relaxed and casually handsome in a crisp linen shirt, while a young woman posed next to the heavy oak double doors. She looked barely 25 years old, radiant and aggressively glamorous, hiding half her face behind oversized designer sunglasses. She was puckering her lips, taking rapid-fire selfies with my ancestral home as her personal aesthetic backdrop. Julian was actually laughing, reaching out to tuck a stray lock of hair behind her ear with a tenderness he had not shown me in years. I threw the car into park and stepped out, the gravel crunching loudly beneath my boots. The sharp sound broke their little bubble. The girl lowered her phone, peering at me with mild annoyance rather than guilt, as if I had just ruined her perfect lighting. Julian slowly turned his head. I expected panic. I expected him to scramble, to drop his hands, to stammer out some pathetic, desperate excuse. He did none of that. His smile merely flattened into a thin, calculating, icy line. Julian. "Who is this?" I asked, my voice trembling violently despite my desperate attempt to keep it steady and professional. "This is Mia," he said flatly, not bothering to step away from her. He reached onto the porch swing, picked up a thick brown manila folder, and walked down the steps toward me. Without a single shred of hesitation or remorse, he tossed it hard against my chest. I scrambled to catch the heavy envelope before it hit the wet gravel. "What is this?" I breathed, staring blindly at the seal. "It is exactly what it looks like. Nova," Julian sneered, crossing his arms over his chest. "Divorce papers, already signed by me, and underneath that, a legally binding court order for you to vacate the premises immediately." My brain, usually capable of processing complex data streams in milliseconds, completely stalled. The words made no sense. "Vacate, Julian. This is my house. My aunt left this property to me." Julian let out a sharp, mocking bark of laughter that echoed across the lawn. "Not anymore, sweetheart. You really should pay closer attention to what you sign when you are so busy staring at your precious computer screens. Remember that general power of attorney you authorized last year? So I could handle the estate tax issues while you were stuck in Tokyo. I put it to very good use." He took a step closer, his eyes glinting with a malicious, greedy triumph. "I sold it, Nova. I sold the entire estate to a commercial real estate conglomerate. It was a cash deal, $12 million. And because you gave me full financial control, The funds went straight into an offshore holding account you cannot even track, let alone touch. I also took the liberty of freezing our joint bank accounts this morning. You have exactly $0 to your name right now." Mia giggled from the porch, adjusting her expensive sunglasses. "You really are clueless, aren't you? Come on, babe. It is going to rain. Let the delivery driver or whoever she is leave so we can pack." "You cannot do this," I whispered, the blood draining entirely from my face. "It is illegal. It is massive fraud." "It is done," Julian countered, his tone turning venomous and hard. "You have 30 minutes to pack a single bag of clothes and get off my property, or I am calling the police for trespassing. Goodbye, Nova." He turned his back on me, walked up the stairs, wrapped his arm tightly around Mia's waist, and walked right into my house, slamming the heavy door shut. The sky above Charleston broke open, unleashing a torrential afternoon downpour. I stood there shivering in the pouring rain, the brown folder heavy and soaked in my numb hands. The world I had built and nurtured over 8 years had just been completely annihilated in less than 5 minutes. With no money, no home, and a shattered heart, I had no choice but to get back into my car and drive away from my own legacy. I spent the remainder of that bleak afternoon begging a cheap motel clerk to let me pay for a shabby room with my emergency corporate credit card. That night in the dingy, damp motel room, staring at peeling wallpaper and water stains, was the absolute worst night of my life. I lay on the lumpy mattress, listening to the heavy rain beat against the cracked window, choking on my own bitter tears of betrayal. The morning sun filtering through the cheap, cracked blinds of the motel room felt offensive to my red, swollen eyes. I had spent the entire night drowning in grief. But as the digital clock on the bedside table flashed 7 in the morning, a distinct shift occurred inside my brain. The tears stopped abruptly. I was a senior systems architect. My entire professional life was dedicated to identifying structural failures, tracing the source of malicious code, and neutralizing catastrophic threats. Julian was simply a destructive virus that had bypassed my personal firewall. Crying over corrupted data was useless. It was time to debug the system. I picked up my phone and dialed the only contact that mattered. Silas Thorne was my late aunt's personal attorney, an eccentric man in his late 70s who still used a manual typewriter and adamantly refused to own a cellular phone. When he finally answered his office landline, I quickly explained the disaster, expecting him to panic, scream, or immediately begin drafting emergency legal injunctions to freeze the assets. Instead, a long, raspy sigh echoed through the receiver. "Come down to the office, Nova," Silas said, his voice completely devoid of urgency or surprise. "And buy yourself a strong black coffee on the way. You are going to need a very clear head for this." 45 minutes later, I walked into Silas Thorne's dimly lit, wood-paneled office located deep in the historic district. The room smelled heavily of old parchment, worn leather, and rich pipe tobacco. Silas sat behind a massive mahogany desk that was practically buried under leaning towers of legal documents. He did not offer any pitying glances or sympathetic platitudes when I sat down. He simply reached into a locked bottom drawer, pulled out a heavy yellow document, and slid it across the polished wood toward me. It was an original, certified copy of the deed to my aunt's estate. "I am sorry, Silas," I said, my voice tight with frustration. "But looking at the deed does not help me right now. Julian used the general power of attorney. He legally bypassed my signature. The corporate buyer is already claiming ownership, and they have the paperwork to prove it." Silas adjusted his gold wire-rimmed spectacles and tapped a gnarled finger on a specific, densely packed paragraph near the very bottom of the page. "Your aunt was a brilliant, highly paranoid woman, Nova. She knew the exact monetary value of that land, and she knew the boundless greed of men. Read the section highlighted in faded red ink." I leaned forward, my eyes scanning the complex legal jargon. The terminology was dense, but as I read the words, the underlying architecture of the contract began to reveal itself. "What exactly does this mean in practical terms?" I asked, looking up. Silas leaned back in his leather chair, steepling his fingers together. It means your property was never transferred to you in a standard, absolute manner. It was inherited under a highly restrictive, incredibly rare legal framework known as a fee simple determinable status. It is a very old, very rigid property law. He paused, letting the silence hang in the dusty air to ensure I was grasping the weight of his words. This specific deed is permanently, inextricably tied to the strict oversight of a historic heritage conservation society. The hidden clause is absolute and merciless. It states clearly that any attempt to commercially sell, subdivide, or demolish this property without the explicit unanimous written consent of 3 specific members of the Conservation Board will trigger an immediate, irreversible reversion of ownership. I frowned, trying to process the cold logic of the law. A reversion. You mean the sale Julian made is invalid? I mean the deed effectively self-destructs, Silas corrected sharply, a glint of predatory amusement in his old eyes. The very second your husband's signature hit that commercial transfer agreement, the property title instantly evaporated from his possession, and by direct extension, from the corporate buyer's possession. There is no grace period. There is no appeal process. There is absolutely no court injunction required to stop them. Ownership automatically, and legally, transferred into a closed, impenetrable blind trust operated by a hidden billionaire who funds the Conservation Society. I stared at the old lawyer, feeling the chaotic, deafening noise in my head suddenly snap into perfect, crystalline silence. The system's architect in me finally saw the source code clearly. The trap had always been there, built securely into the very foundation of the estate. Julian thought he had outsmarted me. He thought he had executed the perfect, untraceable scam. So, the real estate conglomerate, I started, the words forming slowly as the massive scale of the situation set in. They handed over $12 million. They paid $12 million for a worthless piece of scrap paper, Silas finished, a grim, highly satisfied smile touching the corners of his mouth. A legally dead title. They own absolutely nothing. The crushing weight of despair that had suffocated me for the past 24 hours vanished entirely. It was instantly replaced by a terrifying, absolute calmness. Julian had not just stolen my inheritance, he had successfully defrauded a massive, ruthless commercial syndicate. He had taken $12 million of dirty money from corporate sharks who would undoubtedly tear him apart limb from limb the moment they realized they had been conned. He was currently walking around the city, bragging about his newfound wealth, playing house with his shiny new girlfriend, completely oblivious to the fact that he was sitting squarely on top of a massive, ticking time bomb, and the timer had already hit 0. "Silas," I said, my voice as cold and sharp as a scalpel, "tell me exactly how many days it takes for the Conservation Society to notify the buyers that their $12 million investment does not exist." For the next 21 days, I watched my soon-to-be ex-husband perform a masterclass in modern vulgarity. Mia's social media accounts transformed into a relentless, high-definition broadcast of their stolen wealth. It was all so painfully cliché. There was a photo of her draped over the hood of a brand-new, customized Porsche 911, the caption reading, "Out with the old, in with the new, upgrading my life in every way." There were videos of them popping vintage champagne on a rented luxury yacht, clinking crystal flutes while Julian stared into the camera with a smug, self-satisfied smirk. Every single post was a poorly disguised, incredibly tacky victory lap aimed directly at me. While they were busy curating their digital illusion, I was living in a beige, 300-square-foot studio apartment situated above a noisy dry cleaner. I owned 2 coffee mugs, a mattress on the floor, and my high-performance corporate laptop. I funneled every ounce of my rage into my work at CipherEdge Innovations. I was leading the architecture of a massive, multi-tiered security software framework for our most demanding clients. I spent 18 hours a day writing complex encryption algorithms, debugging deep-level system errors, and building digital fortresses that could withstand the most brutal cyber assaults. Every line of code I compiled was a testament to my patience. I found a dark, poetic irony in the situation. I was systematically securing highly sensitive data while patiently waiting for Julian's incredibly insecure house of cards to collapse under the weight of his own arrogance. Exactly 3 weeks after the illegal sale, the corporate buyers finally made their move. The investment group had no interest in the delicate, historic architecture of my aunt's home. They saw only prime, highly profitable acreage. On a crisp Tuesday morning, a fleet of heavy diesel excavators and bulldozers rolled up the cobblestone driveway, ready to tear the legacy down to the dirt. But before the first steel claw could even scratch the historic brickwork, a convoy of black sports utility vehicles forcefully blocked the estate gates. The real estate conglomerate's site manager stepped forward, waving his authorized work permits, fully expecting to swat away a minor local zoning dispute. Instead, he was greeted by the severe, unyielding presence of federal marshals stepping out of the vehicles, standing firmly alongside the lead litigation attorneys for the Heritage Conservation Society. The ensuing confrontation was swift and entirely one-sided. "You are trespassing on a federally protected trust," the lead conservation attorney announced, his voice carrying clearly over the loud, idling engines of the bulldozers. "Shut the machinery down immediately." The site manager laughed, pulling out his phone to call his corporate superiors. "We own this land. We bought it for $12 million cash 3 weeks ago. We have the deed right here." The attorney did not even blink. He reached into his briefcase and handed the manager a single, heavily stamped sheet of paper. It was an emergency federal injunction, accompanied by a detailed legal brief explaining the rigid mechanics of the fee simple determinable clause. "Your deed is a fraudulent document," the attorney stated flatly. "The individual who sold you this property did not possess the legal right to bypass the Conservation Board. The moment the commercial transaction was processed, the title automatically reverted back to our closed trust. You own nothing. Now, remove your heavy equipment before I have every single operator arrested for federal trespassing." The fallout within the corporate headquarters of the real estate conglomerate was apocalyptic. This was not a group of amateur house flippers or naive local investors. They were a ruthless, multi-billion-dollar private equity firm known for destroying their competitors and burying their enemies in endless litigation. When their elite legal department descended upon the transaction records, they quickly realized the Conservation Society's trap was legally flawless. The historic contract was airtight. Their $12 million had effectively vanished into the ether, swallowed by a complex web of offshore holding accounts tied to a man who had brazenly sold them a total fabrication. Organizations of that magnitude do not simply absorb a loss of that size. They view it as an act of war. They immediately dispatch their most aggressive forensic accountants and private investigators, pointing the full, terrifying weight of their legal and financial arsenal directly at Julian's throat. Oblivious to the massive storm tearing toward him, Julian was busy celebrating his own imaginary genius. That same evening, he took Mia to the most exclusive, ridiculously expensive Michelin-starred restaurant in the city. He ordered a $1,000 bottle of wine, fresh oysters, and white truffles. He sat in a plush velvet booth, undoubtedly feeling like a king who had successfully conquered his kingdom. When the meal concluded, he casually tossed his heavy metal black credit card onto the silver presentation tray. He continued chatting with Mia, not even glancing at the waiter who carried it away. 5 minutes later, the restaurant manager returned. He did not look apologetic. He looked distinctly uncomfortable. "Excuse me, sir," the manager whispered, leaning down so the neighboring tables would not hear. "Your card has been declined." Julian frowned, waving his hand dismissively. "That is impossible. Run it again, or just use the other platinum card in my wallet. My accounts have more than enough to buy this entire restaurant." "Sir, we tried all 3 of your cards," the manager replied, his tone growing much firmer. "Every single one of them returned a hard decline code. Your issuing bank informed us that your entire financial portfolio has been subjected to a total asset freeze. You currently have zero available funds. Julian's smug smile finally shattered. The color drained completely from his face as the brutal, icy reality of his situation crashed into his manufactured paradise. The trap had finally snapped shut. The silence from my phone did not last long. Within 24 hours of the restaurant incident, my screen began lighting up with relentless consistency. Julian called me 10 times the first day. By the third day, he was calling upwards of 50 times a day. I never answered a single one. I simply sat in my quiet, sparse apartment, listening to the voicemails pile up, documenting his rapid psychological unraveling. At first, his messages were pure, arrogant rage. Nova, pick up the phone. I know you did something to the deed. Fix this technical glitch immediately, or I am taking you to court and ruining you. By the end of the week, the threats dissolved into sheer, unadulterated panic. The voicemails left at 3 o'clock in the morning featured heavy breathing and a trembling voice. Nova, please, you have to help me. They have frozen everything. I cannot even buy a cup of coffee. Please, just call me back. I am begging you. I felt no pity, only cold, clinical curiosity. Why was he unraveling so fast? $12 million was a massive sum. But the absolute terror in his voice suggested something far more sinister than a frozen bank account. To find the missing variables in this equation, I used a portion of my latest corporate bonus to hire a highly discreet private investigator. 4 days later, the investigator met me at a quiet coffee shop and slid a thick, encrypted tablet across the table. The data inside illuminated the dark, desperate truth behind Julian's sudden urgency to sell my ancestral home. He was not just greedy. He was drowning in an ocean of debt. For the past 2 years, while I was busy building security systems, Julian had been recklessly gambling on illegal, highly volatile cryptocurrency margin trades. He had bypassed legitimate trading platforms, diving into unregulated offshore exchanges run by shadow brokers and dangerous underworld syndicates. The market had crashed hard, wiping him out completely. He owed these shadowy figures a staggering $8 million. The sudden sale of my estate was a desperate survival tactic. He needed the $12 million to instantly wipe clean his underworld debts, while keeping a tidy $4 million for himself to fund his new, extravagant lifestyle with his mistress. But now, the asset freeze had triggered a catastrophic chain reaction. Julian was caught in a lethal vice grip. On one side, a ruthless, multi-billion-dollar real estate conglomerate was demanding the immediate return of their $12 million. On the other side, violent underworld creditors were demanding their $8 million. Julian had absolutely no access to capital, zero leverage, and nowhere to hide. He was a dead man walking. The suffocating pressure inevitably fractured the very foundation of his new, shiny life. Mia, the glamorous girl who loved the cameras and the luxury yachts, was fundamentally a creature of opportunity. She had attached herself to a golden goose, but she had zero intention of staying when the gold turned to rust. According to the investigator's timeline, the breaking point happened on a Tuesday night inside the expensive luxury penthouse Julian was renting. Mia was walking past his home office when she overheard a terrifying speakerphone conversation. The lead litigation attorney for the corporate conglomerate was not using polite legal terms. He was systematically detailing how they were going to dismantle Julian's life piece by piece, throw him into federal prison, and seize every single asset tied to his name, including the personal belongings of anyone closely associated with him. Mia realized instantly that she was chained to a sinking ship. She did not scream. She did not cry. She simply acted with the same cold self-interest that Julian had shown me. While Julian was locked inside his office, pacing the floor, tearing his hair out, and hyperventilating over his impending doom, Mia quietly moved through the penthouse. She packed her designer luggage with every piece of expensive clothing she could fit. She raided the safe, taking the heavy diamond necklaces, the platinum watches, and the thick stacks of emergency cash. Finally, she grabbed the keys to the custom Porsche 911 he had bought her just weeks prior. She walked out the front door, rode the elevator down to the garage, and vanished into the night without leaving a single note, text message, or word of goodbye. When Julian finally emerged from his office the next morning, exhausted and broken, he found an empty apartment. He was completely alone, abandoned by the very woman he had destroyed our marriage for. But a broken heart was the least of his concerns. That same afternoon, the real estate conglomerate struck their fatal blow. They officially bypassed civil mediation entirely. Their legal team filed a massive lawsuit for grand theft, gross misrepresentation, and large-scale corporate fraud, because the illegal transaction involved multiple offshore holding accounts, wire transfers exceeding $10 million, and cross-state banking systems. The jurisdiction immediately shifted. The lawsuit officially escalated the situation from a messy civil dispute into a severe federal criminal case. The Federal Bureau of Investigation was handed the dossier. The vice around Julian's neck was no longer just tightening, it had locked shut. The official deposition did not take place in a traditional courtroom. It happened on a gray Thursday morning inside a massive, sterile conference room located on the 65th floor of a downtown skyscraper. This was the fortress of the corporate law firm representing the real estate conglomerate. The room was composed entirely of soundproof glass and polished chrome, and the ambient temperature was kept aggressively cold, hovering somewhere around 60 degrees. It was a room designed specifically to intimidate, to strip away comfort, and to make targets feel incredibly small. When Julian finally walked through the heavy glass doors, the transformation in his appearance was genuinely shocking. He looked as though he had aged 10 years in a matter of weeks. The confident golden boy who had stood on my porch in a crisp linen shirt was entirely gone. He was wearing an ill-fitting, wrinkled suit, likely the only one he had access to since his premium wardrobe had been locked away in the abandoned penthouse. His skin possessed a sickly, pale, grayish tint. Deep, bruised purple circles hung heavily beneath his bloodshot eyes, and his hands trembled violently as he pulled out a chair. He was utterly and completely alone. There was no high-priced defense attorney sitting beside him. His frozen assets meant he had been forced to rely on a severely overworked public defender who looked equally exhausted and completely outmatched by the 10 corporate sharks sitting across the mahogany table. The lead litigation attorney, a sharply dressed man named Harrison, did not offer a handshake or a polite greeting. He simply opened a massive, 4-inch thick binder and began the systematic execution of Julian's remaining dignity. "We are not here to negotiate," Harrison stated, his voice devoid of any human warmth. "We are here to formally document the depth of your fraud before we hand our comprehensive findings over to the federal prosecutor's office. Let us begin with Exhibit A." Harrison slid a high-resolution, laminated document across the long table. "This is the sworn affidavit, waiving the historic conservation rights of the Charleston estate. It bears what appears to be the signature of the legal property owner, Nova Dixon. You presented this specific document to our acquisitions team to assure them the deed transfer would be unencumbered." Julian stared down at the paper, swallowing hard, his Adam's apple bobbing nervously in his throat. He remained silent. "Our forensic handwriting experts analyzed this document thoroughly over the past 72 hours, Harrison continued, his tone methodical and relentless. "They cross-referenced the pen pressure, the stroke angles, and the ink composition with 20 known samples of Nova Dixon's authentic signature. The conclusion was unanimous and undeniable. This signature is a complete forgery. You traced it, poorly, and then you notarized it using a fraudulent digital stamp." Julian licked his dry lips, his voice cracking horribly when he finally spoke. "You cannot prove I was the one who signed it. It could have been anyone. Nova could have signed it herself and then purposefully altered her handwriting just to set me up. Yes, she set me up." It was the most pathetic, desperate defense I had ever heard, and it was exactly my cue. The heavy glass door opened, and I walked into the conference room. I did not look angry. I did not look vindictive. I wore a tailored charcoal blazer, my hair pulled back neatly, carrying nothing but a small, encrypted titanium hard drive. I projected the exact same calm, professional demeanor I used when presenting architectural software models to Fortune 500 executives. Julian flinched so violently when he saw me that his knee slammed into the underside of the heavy table. He gripped the edges of his chair, staring at me with wide, terrified eyes as I took the empty seat positioned directly next to Harrison. "Miss Dixon," Harrison nodded respectfully. "Thank you for joining us. Do you have the requested data?" "I do," I replied smoothly, sliding the titanium drive across the polished wood. As a senior systems architect, I have a distinct preference for highly integrated environments. Over the past 3 years, I custom-built the smart home network for the Charleston estate. It controls the climate, the security protocols, and the ambient lighting. It also features voice-activated modules located in every single room. As part of my standard security configuration, the system passively records and encrypts all ambient audio, backing it up directly to an off-site, secure server I maintain personally. The system cannot be bypassed, and the timestamps cannot be altered. The color drained so rapidly from Julian's face that I genuinely thought he might lose consciousness. He knew exactly what he had said inside those walls. "On this drive," I continued, addressing the room of lawyers while maintaining direct, unblinking eye contact with Julian, "is an isolated, unedited audio file recorded inside the primary study of my home exactly 6 months and 4 days ago." Harrison plugged the drive into a sleek laptop resting on the table. He pressed a button, and the crisp, high-definition audio filled the freezing conference room. Julian's own arrogant voice echoed off the glass walls. "Listen to me. I do not care about the Historic Preservation Board. I have the general power of attorney. I will just forge Nova's signature on the waiver. She is so buried in her coding projects, she never looks at the physical mail anyway. We finalize the commercial sale. I take the $12 million. I pay off the offshore accounts, and I'm gone before she even gets back from Tokyo. It is foolproof." The audio clip ended, plunging the room into a heavy, suffocating silence. The recording was the ultimate death blow. It proved premeditation. It proved malicious intent. It proved, beyond any shadow of a reasonable doubt, that he had orchestrated a massive federal crime. Julian shattered completely. The fragile, imaginary reality he had clung to finally collapsed. He slammed his fists down on the mahogany table, tears of pure panic streaming down his pale cheeks. "She trapped me!" he screamed, his voice shrill and hysterical, pointing a shaking finger directly at my face. "She knew about the debts. She let me sell the house knowing the deed would bounce. She is a sociopath. You have to arrest her, not me." His desperate outburst earned nothing but absolute, freezing contempt from every single professional in the room. The lead attorney closed his massive binder with a loud, definitive snap that echoed like a gunshot. "You are a remarkably foolish man," Harrison said, his voice dripping with profound disgust. "Miss Dixon did not force you to accumulate $8 million in illegal syndicate debt. Miss Dixon did not force you to commit federal identity theft, and she certainly did not force you to defraud a multinational investment group out of $12 million. You built this cage entirely by yourself." Julian slumped back into his chair, the last remaining ounces of fight leaving his body in a shuddering exhale. He stared blankly at his own trembling hands resting on the table. In that quiet, sterile room, the full gravity of his situation finally crushed him. There was no loophole to exploit. There was no mistress to distract him. He had lost his wealth, his reputation, and his freedom. He was staring directly down the barrel of 10 to 15 years in a maximum security federal penitentiary for grand larceny, wire fraud, and forgery, and he knew, with absolute certainty, that he would not survive it. The federal trial moved with terrifying mechanical efficiency, but there was one final, crucial detail that Julian never learned, a hidden variable I kept strictly to myself until the very end: the anonymous billionaire who funded the Historic Conservation Trust, the shadowy figure who automatically absorbed the estate title the second Julian committed his fraud, was not a stranger. His name was Arthur Sterling. He was the primary financial stakeholder and the largest technology partner for my firm, CipherEdge Innovations. The morning I sat in Silas Thorne's dusty office and learned about the deed's hidden trap, I did not simply rely on the slow gears of the legal system to save me. I took immediate action. I made a direct, highly encrypted phone call to Arthur. I explained exactly what my husband had done and provided him with the corporate buyer's transaction data. That was the real reason the Conservation Board moved with such unprecedented, lethal speed. I had handed the billionaire the exact coordinates of the threat on day one, and he dropped the legal hammer before Julian even had time to realize he was standing on the target. We had orchestrated a flawless counterattack. When the federal judge finally handed down the sentence a few months later, the courtroom was dead silent. Julian was convicted of multiple counts of grand-scale wire fraud, aggravated identity theft, and corporate financial manipulation. The judge stared down from the bench with absolute disdain and sentenced him to 12 years in a high-security federal penitentiary, completely without the possibility of early parole. Furthermore, he was ordered to pay back the full $12 million in restitution to the real estate conglomerate. It was a staggering sum he would never, ever be able to generate in 10 lifetimes. As the federal marshals placed the heavy steel handcuffs on his wrists and led him out of the courtroom, he did not even try to look back at me. His shoulders were slumped, his eyes vacant. He was nothing but an empty, hollow shell of a man heading into a concrete box. With the criminal proceedings officially closed, the estate was permanently secured within the protective vault of the Heritage Trust. But a beautiful house meant to be lived in cannot stay an empty museum forever. Thanks to the successful deployment of my massive security software project, I received the largest corporate performance bonus in the history of my company. I did not use the money to buy flashy sports cars or charter luxury yachts to show off to strangers on the internet. Instead, I sat down with Arthur and Silas over a cup of hot coffee. Using my project earnings, I legally purchased the exclusive lifetime management and residential rights to my ancestral home for the symbolic, nominal fee of exactly $1. The transaction was completely legal, entirely airtight, and forever sanitized of Julian's toxic stain. He had zero claim to it, and he never would again. A month later, I stood on the sprawling second-floor balcony of my Charleston mansion. The evening air was perfectly still, carrying the sweet scent of blooming jasmine and a salty sea breeze from the courtyard below. I held a cool glass of expensive red wine in my hand, watching the brilliant golden and deep purple hues of the sunset wash over my meticulously preserved gardens. The silence surrounding me was not lonely. It was absolute, profound, and beautifully peaceful. Taking a slow sip of my wine, I smiled into the twilight. I finally understood the greatest truth of all. The absolute most perfect revenge is not lowering yourself to destroy another person with your own two hands. It is simply stepping back, ascending to your own radiant peak, and peacefully watching your enemies enthusiastically burn themselves to ashes, using nothing but the spark of their own bottomless greed. Thank you so much for listening to today's story. We hope you enjoyed it. As an ad-free channel, your support is what keeps us alive. Please support Zoe Revenge Stories with just $1 via the QR code on the screen, or click the link in the description box or pinned comment. Also, we'd love to connect with you. Please leave a comment telling us which city or state you're listening from. Thank you for standing with us, and see you in the next stories.